We're going to invite a few more people to come on. Number one is Adrianna Radkin. She'll be telling us what she does she's with an organization called Marin CIL. She can explain that in more detail. The second one is Jody Timms, who wears a number of hats. And the third one is Wendy Todd. So I will say a little bit more when we introduce each person about what they do, and they can speak for themselves too on this. So this is going to be a little bit of an informal roundtable discussion. I invite all of you to take yourselves off mute because we can all talk over with each other if we need to. That's not a problem and whatnot here. So we'll just have some fun with this. So I'll just kind of get it started a little bit. So Adrianna, you're with Marin Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. Hope I said it right.
You got it right.
All right. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what your organization does.
Sure. So Marin VOAD, Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster, is a collaboration of nonprofit organizations, faith-based organizations, other community-based organizations, as well as government agencies. And our mission really is to foster effective service delivery to everybody who is affected by disasters through this collaborative network. So we work with organizations like Marin CIL. We work with organizations all over Marin, and I can get into a little bit of that later. But the idea is, if you are coordinated and you're communicating well with one another, you avoid duplicate services, you're more efficient in your service delivery, and you're more effective. And the organizations that we work with are all of the ones across Marin who work with vulnerable residents and visitors who are most at risk in disaster.
Well, that's great. And it's wonderful that there is a forum for all the organizations to get together. We'll talk more about best practices, sharing, and so forth, but it really helps us to all be better prepared. So Jody Timms, you're next, and we've known each other for quite a while, and I know you're very active with the neighborhood response groups programs, and also with Age-Friendly Fairfax. So you want to tell us a little bit about some of the things that you're doing?
Sure. So neighborhood response groups, for those of you who aren't familiar with that, and NRG is the short term, if I slip into that, they were created essentially as a grassroots community organizing tool here in Marin, or at least we have a very effective model here in Marin about 10 years ago. The purpose of an NRG is to acquaint neighbors in small groups with each other and what their needs are and what their resources are. So as we know, if there is a disaster of some kind, particularly the disasters where you would need to shelter in place, so earthquake, power shut off, floods, things like that, as opposed to wildfire where you're going to evacuate, most likely at some point. When you, if there is a disaster, you may well not see a first responder for a couple of days, even depending upon the severity of what's happening more globally. So the best thing is for folks to be able to know at least a half a dozen neighbors, if not a larger group, so that you can be familiar with who might have access and functional needs, who might have resources who could be helpful in that situation. So an NRG, it consists of usually a small, there are blocks within the larger NRG. A block is usually 10 to 20 homes. And there are two block captains typically who get to know the people in those homes and gather information from them, contact information, who lives there, what kinds of disabilities or AFN needs they might have. Do they have tools, chainsaws, tents, sleeping bags, in the event of a somewhat prolonged need to shelter in place? These are your neighbors you're going to turn to and rely on and support as might be needed in a disaster.
Well, that's great. And how about Age-Friendly Fairfax?
So Age-Friendly Fairfax is again, a grassroots organizing model that was initially age-friendly movement was started by the World Health Organization about 15 years ago. And it is a process where a city or a town decides that they would like to particularly address the needs of older adults and AFN folks in that community. So working with your mayor and your town council, you apply at this point through AARP in the United States to become an age-friendly community, which means that you're aiming to improve a number of things within your town, within your communities, to better support older adults and very often folks with disabilities. So that's the process. Fairfax is an age-friendly community, was granted that status, as are 9 of the 11 cities and towns in Marin. We're all at different stages of our sort of 5-year process, but all of us essentially have a task force, and we have connections with the business community, with our residents, with the local government, to improve the conditions of our cities and towns for older adults, and to build community, and in particular, to locate and find the folks who are in our communities who do have additional needs because of age or disability, and better support those folks within our cities and towns.
That's wonderful. I think we're beginning to create a theme here of these different organizations which exist at different levels that do naturally work together to make all of us safer in event of disaster. So that's really kind of what a lot of all this is all about tonight. Wendy Todd is a consultant to Marin Center for Independent Living, but she also is a leader of what we call a Firewise site. Wendy, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and Firewise and so forth?
Yeah, thank you for having me on. And I'm a big fan of Marin Center for Independent Living. My family has received services from the organization, and just to say something about Firewise, and I live in San Anselmo. A couple years ago, their garage caught on fire at the end of my dead end street up a hill. And the fire department told the neighbor that called it in to call everybody on the street and have them shelter in place so the fire trucks could come up our one-way, very small, tiny street. And he realized he didn't have anybody's contact information. And so we started organizing, and then realized that there are all these neighborhood groups and very organized. And so my little street became part of the Bald Hill Firewise community. And I'm going to put in the chat the link, because you can scroll through and look to see if your neighborhood is part of the sort of this organizing entity. And it's really just volunteers who are wanting to stay connected to one another. And also, as you organize, you are able to access resources like free chipper days, for example. And so I highly recommend folks to, like we've been saying, to connect with the supports and the services that are out there. And to, yes, if you're looking to volunteer, walk down your street and knock on some doors, or put a note in the mailbox, as I have done, to say, hey, do you know about these resources that are available, particularly for people with disabilities or access and functional needs? That is something you can do tomorrow. You can volunteer right in your own neighborhood and get engaged.
Well, that's great. I think we kind of hear from both Jody and Wendy that this is sort of right at the level of neighbor helping neighbor. And it begins, as Eli said, with the handshake. Let me introduce myself. We get to meet each other and all. And in my own opinion, that's the most effective way to help empower people. It's one thing if we're sitting up there at a fairly high level saying, you should harden your home or create a fire smart lawn, here's how the tips to do it. But when your next door neighbor's talking to you about what to do or finding out if you need help, that's extremely powerful. We'll talk more about how NRGs and Firewise, really, although they have slightly different missions, are very compatible and work well. But at kind of a next level up is really where Adrianna's working with larger organizations. I was a volunteer for the Red Cross for quite a while, and I was always really amazed that no matter where you go in the country, faith-based organizations play a huge role in disasters. Are there faith-based organizations participating in Marin VOAD?
There are, though not quite at the Red Cross level that you're talking about, because the faith organizations in Marin tend to be smaller. They may have a national partner and a national relationship, but that may not be their focus. In terms of disaster services. But in Marin, you can sort of expect that faith organizations, the small local congregations, are going to have strong connections with their communities. They most likely will set up feeding. They may want to or actually be affiliated with a Red Cross shelter. So they may want to or be able to set up a shelter. There's no doubt that they would provide spiritual and emotional care in a mass disaster where it's needed, as well as just sort of the calm, comfort, and communication. I think that faith leaders are trusted, reliable people within their communities, and they can help deliver important messages. So that's probably one of the biggest ways that they'll be active. Just to touch a little bit on the Red Cross, because I think that they're an important element of the VOAD as well. You've got everybody from these local faith organizations, local, little churches or synagogues or other houses of worship. You've got small community-based organizations, some that are very local, like West Marin Community Services or San Geronimo Valley Community Center, Canal Alliance in the Canal, North Marin Community Services in Novato, and then sort of working your way up. There are other organizations like Marin CIL that are kind of all county-wide, Homeward Bound, St. Vincent de Paul that work with the homeless, Community Action Marin, there are a number of them. They're all part of the VOAD. And then you get to these large disaster service organizations, the Red Crosses. And in Marin, we have Red Cross and the Salvation Army, both of which are national. They have tremendous resources to pull on. They're active in the VOAD. Actually, both of them are also part of our executive team. And that gets into sort of the power of VOAD. There's the Marin VOAD. There are other Bay Area local VOADs, and some of them go by COADs, just to throw out another acronym for all of you: Community Organizations Active in Disaster, as opposed to Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. We're all organized within the NorCal VOAD. So Northern California has one, and then there's a national VOAD. And that's where these large faith disaster service providers get involved. So Lutherans and Mennonites and the Adventists, they'll all come in a disaster and often are connected through VOADs, and they will provide resources and help where needed. So I hope I painted a decent picture, but I wanted to present sort of from the very local level up to these national faith organizations that also get involved.
Well, that was really well done. And I really think it shows, for a county like Marin, the role of Marin VOAD really at the center of that to help provide coordination and support and training and whatnot for these organizations. Taking a question from the audience, it's a little bit of a follow-up to what you were talking about. Obviously, if you're in some of the bigger cities as San Rafael or Novato, there's going to be more programs, there's more people there, and sometimes there's more money available. How do you find the services to be in, say, unincorporated Marin, out in West Marin, or some of the smaller areas that are not in Mill Valley, but maybe like a Tam Valley, somebody like that?
So most of the services are focused on areas where there are more vulnerable residents. So in West Marin, there are a number of different service providers, two of which I already mentioned. There's also West Marin Senior Services. And then there are much more local, either community centers or organizations that may provide feeding, housing sites. So a place like West Marin actually has a lot of them. And what nonprofits tend to do is they focus where there's a need. So if it's a need among older adults, there will be a nonprofit that generates, that works around that. If there's a need among people with access and functional needs, that's where it will develop. I don't know in Tam Junction in particular if there are any nonprofits or service providers. In Marin City, there are a number of them. Because again, it's where are their needs? Where do people often feel cut off from existing services? Marin City is a large unincorporated area that has had to deal with flooding. They've had to deal with power shutoffs. They've had to deal with a lot of events that have come their way. And based on, various situations, from being physically cut off to maybe, some lower socioeconomic status, there are organizations that will develop to help the residents. But in other parts of Marin, where residents often can find resources on their own, there aren't, as far as I know, nonprofits that work in those areas.
Wonderful, very helpful. Again, quite a smorgasbord of different levels of service, different communities involved, and obviously you want to become a trusted name in the community or not be very effective, and that's why they're all going to be a little bit different and a different size and so forth. So
right.
Pulling them all together is important, though.
If I can just stress, really what VOADs do is they're a collaboration of the nonprofits that are helping the most vulnerable residents. And I think that that's an important distinction. We have lots of neighborhood response groups and Firewise communities where we can help ourselves. But the community-based organizations develop around helping vulnerable residents who often need support and need services.
Wonderful. Well, that lets me come back to Jody and Wendy together to kind of put a finer point on the differences between an NRG and a Firewise community and how they can be compatible and work together. So let me make sure I got this right. So the main focus of a Firewise site is preparation for a wildfire. Learn about alert and warning, learn how to harden your home, learn how to do fire smart landscaping, try to help neighbors to get motivated and coordinated. NRG is more focused on post-event. Granted, before the event, you're gathering names, you're finding information, you're finding about resources in the community and whatnot. But if we were to have, for example, an earthquake, we're gonna have a lot of people still in that community, and the NRG will go around and begin to network with those people and find out what's going on. Have I got that correct?
Sounds good to me. Yep.
All right. So we've run into this before. There are communities, and I think Fairfax, in the best way possible, which is a community with a lot of volunteerism, really has both organizations side by side, and many of the same people are active in both organizations. So I'm sort of wanted to make the point and see if you agree that these two functions are very compatible. You can have the same membership in both organizations if you want to. You can split it up a bit. You can share resources when that's appropriate and whatnot, but both of them have a very important role. And I think they're a huge help to organizations like Marin Center for Independent Living, because you're out there meeting the neighbors and so forth. How's that sound?
Yeah.
Yes, definitely. In Fairfax, we started really, most of the organizing began around Firewise communities. We have 9 of them. And then say Central Marin, Larkspur, Corte Madera, Greenbrae, they really started much more aggressively and initially with the NRG model. So many of those are now adding Firewise, becoming a Firewise community. And in Fairfax and places that started more with Firewise, we are bringing in the NRG model, and sometimes it's the same steering committee that might run both groups or have both methods of organizing the pre and the during and the evacuating, or it might be different groups, so similar groups or different groups. In Fairfax, the NRG leaders and the Firewise leaders, we meet once a month and we talk about both programs and how we're interfacing the work we're doing with community members. And one neighborhood will be really organized and have them integrated, and another neighborhood will have them side by side. So the programs are very compatible with each other and overlay nicely. And it just kind of depends upon the volunteers and the community and how they'd like to work that system and develop it, because it does take a lot of volunteer help and time. So it's only as good as the involvement of the community, for sure.
Well, for those of you who are looking for opportunities to volunteer, there are so many ways you can do it here. One last question for Wendy before we bring Eli back with us. So in trying, one of the things for a Firewise site is really about motivation. How do we motivate our neighbors to become as knowledgeable as possible about fire behavior, what actions they need to take, and encourage people to take those actions? How do you go about motivating people in your Firewise site?
That's a great question. I just talk to my neighbors. We have this common thread, which is we're all very vulnerable. On my street, we're vulnerable. And so I just, I'm getting the reputation of like the worrier, but also the planner, right? And so if you run into me on the street, and then I'm always out there walking my dog, I just have conversations with folks about like, what are they doing about that? Just recently we had an oak tree limb fall and cross the street. At 10 o'clock at night, this huge limb fell down. The fire department had to come to clear the way. And apparently that's what's happening. The fire department had just come from another oak tree. And then a week later, another oak tree down the street lost a limb. So it's what the buzz is about on our street is like, we're in a vulnerable position. And so let's just name it and plan for it and communicate with each other. And so unfortunately, the fear is the motivating factor, but also knowing that we can do something about it together, that we're in it together. And so I find, attending the steering committee for the Bald Hill Firewise community, it's actually, it helps me manage the fear because I realize like we're all working on it together. And I appreciate just being able to communicate out to people that there are resources and we don't have to be so vulnerable. There's things that we can do. And I would just put a plug in for all those of you who are part of either NRG or VOAD or Firewise, that to really include people with disabilities and access and functional needs into your planning. Particularly if you're living in a community where people, maybe English isn't their primary language, or maybe seniors are isolated and homebound, or maybe there's somebody who has a mobility issue who lives way up a flight of stairs. Like those are the folks that I really worry about most. And I think that these volunteer groups, we're doing such a good job of sort of looking out for ourselves. And I worry that we're not looking out enough for our neighbors who maybe aren't participating in the NRG or aren't able to log in and be part of a Firewise community meeting. So I just wanted to put that plug out there as a reminder, as we're all looking out for ourselves, to also look out for our neighbors that might not be the folks that we see on a day-to-day basis.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, that's a great segue to bring Eli back in. And it also kind of ties in with a question, which in a way is similar to what I asked Eli earlier, which is, let's say one of the things we've described in the NRG and Firewise models, we have people literally out in the community who hopefully are getting to know who's in their community and what their needs are. But there could be some sensitivity around that. And this is, I think, a question for Eli. So some people might be reluctant. They have a neighbor and maybe the neighbor's older and they don't see them very much and they don't know if they're doing okay or not. There could be a reluctance to interact with them. Do you have any thoughts about that, how to proceed with that?
Yeah, great point and question. You know, social isolation is real. We're all experiencing it to varying degrees with COVID and these periods of sheltering in place. For people with disabilities and access and functional needs, social isolation is a significant area and really limits one's access to services, support, connection, and emotional and mental health. So I would just say, kind of going back to connecting with your neighbors, just drop off fruit from the garden, or find an excuse to knock on the door, flowers, whatever it is. Those little things are actually really big. Building that connection ahead of time could save someone's life later. Because you know, in a disaster, you won't know what that individual needs until you actually get to know them. And so kind of building that connection, getting over your own, hesitation to knock on a door. If you have a gut feeling that someone in your community might need a little extra help, follow through on it. Be that neighbor. I think it's that community support, and you saw it in the video, in the woman supporting each other. That resiliency that we need more of in Marin.
And I have found that, I've printed out flyers from Marin Center for Independent Living that has the website, the phone number, the resources available. I've left that in people's mailboxes with a note from myself to say, hey, give me a ring if you want to connect. And that has worked. So it's very easy to do, and people really appreciate the information.
Well put. I think, the age of COVID probably set a lot of our organizations back a little bit, understandably. And we're still in a very difficult time for that. Hopefully we'll be able to get out and interact more as we go forward. But I think what I'm hearing from all of you is that we don't really need to be shy about knocking on a door. I'm going to go back to Eli's statement about the warm handshake. That's how things often start. And the worst that can happen is somebody says, I'm not ready to talk to you right now, or whatever. And then to Wendy's point, maybe you have something to leave there. Maybe you bring some flowers, depending on what the individual is and so forth and all. But it's making those connections is really important. I think that, are there some other success stories that you've heard through NRG or Firewise or through VOAD, where by kind of sort of stepping up a little bit in the community, connections have been made that have really helped the community get better prepared?
I mean, I can say from the VOAD perspective that it happens all the time. The VOAD is sort of this hub and spoke visual, if you can think of it that way. And so we're always making connections to organizations to one another, or somebody from even a government agency may reach out to me and ask if I know of anybody who is involved in something specific, and I can name 3 organizations that they should reach out to. So it really is about that warm handshake and getting to know one another and knowing what one's capabilities are. But that happens a lot. The Woodward fire was a perfect example. There were a number of different organizations that were involved, but there was no collaboration. The VOAD got involved and made sure that everybody was talking with each other, so that people weren't duplicating services, so that people were getting what they needed. There's a housing site out there that needed to be in touch with people so that she could help her residents evacuate. Some of them were already connected, others weren't. And so those kinds of connections, real time in the moment, happen a lot in the VOAD.
Well, that's great. I think we also see when we have a real event, to your point, there's a lot of people really do step up. There's a lot of really powerful success stories coming out of you in places like Paradise, despite the death toll and whatnot, of people going out, helping the neighbor. If you don't have a car, don't worry, jump in with me, let's go. So people do oftentimes arise to the occasion when something happens out there. So we're getting near the end of this, and I think one of the things that just came up from the audience is that knocking on the door leads to a point where it's no longer a stranger knocking on the door. So being visible out there and seeing each other makes a big difference. I know in the neighborhood that I live in, we have, we're a Firewise site. We're one of the larger ones. We have over 800 resident homes out here. And so we broke it down into block captains, similar to the way NRG is organized and so forth. And we're sort of doing the same thing, encouraging, and I just kind of giving ideas of how to get organized. As we're coming out of COVID, we're trying to organize some essentially block parties, bring people out, be very visible, that so people be out there. And that's also an opportunity, which we saw 2 years ago, to talk amongst ourselves about, well, did you realize that the person who lives down there in the red house, gosh, I haven't seen him for quite a while. Wow, we should kind of, maybe you can go over there as a small group and help boost your confidence a little bit to speak to the person. And then always having something to bring, I think, goes a long ways towards that. So I think all of those are great opportunities to take. We're getting near the end of things, so I kind of asked each of you if you'd like to give a closing comment. I'll kind of begin with you, Eli.
You know, I just, as Adrianna and others on this panel have pointed out, it really is community work. We're in this together. And, you know, as the Warriors say, strength in numbers. For reaching our community's most vulnerable, individuals with disabilities who are multiply marginalized, maybe financially, you know, in our communities of color, I think we all need to step up. We all have a responsibility to do more, recognizing that equity impacts diverse communities at a greater level, and disasters impact our communities at a greater level. So, you know, this year we've expanded our partnership through Powered and Prepared to 8 key community-based organizations. Adrianna mentioned several of them. I'll just say Community Action Marin, Marin City Community Services District, Canal Alliance, North Marin Community Services, Integrated Community Services, Vivalon, Marin Asian Advocacy Project, and West Marin Community Services are all subcontractors with us in this work. We really see this as an equity program and initiative. So just adding that layer to all of our disaster response work is essential, and we're committed to that. And Rach, I just want to say again, thank you for all the work that you and the team at Fire Safe Marin and all the Firewise volunteers are doing out in the community. We look forward to continuing to build what we've started and build it together and build it better. So thank you.
Thanks, Eli. Adrianna?
I'll just keep it brief and leave you with next steps. Sign up for Alert Marin and Nixle if you haven't already. That's probably one of the most important things you can do. And then check on a neighbor and make sure they've signed up. I'll keep it short and sweet.
Next steps, that's great. And I just will kind of echo that. Be sure you sign up through Marin Center for Independent Living now if you think you might be in need, and they'll work with you. Early sign up, be prepared. Jody?
You know, I mean, it's wonderful if your community has gotten organized to be Firewise and or an NRG, but it's also just, as we've said, really important to reach out to 1 or 2 or 3 neighbors around you. So if you can do that, whether you're able to offer help or you might need help, just having the contact information from 1 or 2 neighbors and being sure they have yours, so that if, you know, push comes to shove, you're not completely alone. Any of us, even when we live in a household of folks, we can be home alone in the middle of a disaster. And so you want to have more than, you need a little backup. So I would definitely encourage people to reach out to at least 1 or 2 neighbors and exchange contact information and talk about whether or not you're prepared for disasters.
Great advice. Wendy?
I just want to say thank you, Rich, to you and your team, because we need more organizations like you who really want to partner and bring people with disabilities to the table and to put a spotlight on the community that has so much assets and offers so much to make our community so vibrant. And it's not often that that folks get invited to the table. So we really appreciate how wonderful you've been to work with and accommodating, and just really grateful for the partnership and the opportunity.
Thank you. Maurice, I see you're back with us. Closing thoughts?
I've been here all the time.
Oh.
My main thing is just using the phone number that we gave earlier, 415-459-6245, extension 10. If you're having any sort of problem with navigating our system at all, we will help from there, and we get back to you promptly.
Wonderful. Well, again, thanks to all of you. You guys are just doing fantastic work out there. It is all about working together. You're going to see from Fire Safe Marin going forward. As I mentioned, we're going to a new format starting in September, a new TV show format, kind of exciting. But you're going to see one of the lenses that we're always going to have in all of our programming going forward is a real sensitivity to the needs of the access and functional needs community. That's really important as an issue of equity, that we always keep that as a big part of our mission and a key part of where we're going forward. So we're very excited about our relatively new partnership with the Marin Center for Independent Living. And of course, thanks to VOAD and NRG and everybody else, we really appreciate it. So we hope we'll probably all be back again in the future in a little different format, because everybody here are real go-getters in Marin. All right, everybody, thank you so much.